Hi there, my name is Troels, and before we get started, I just want to ask for forgiveness. Obviously, these vlogs are far and in between, in part because we've been working a little bit on this thing here, but also some other projects we're in the middle of. I think with the vlogs, in my case, they're probably not going to come out at a daily or weekly basis. I tend to want to just have something to talk about, and it's not that frequent I do. But today I do, and we'll be talking a little bit about the Prophet X as well. But I actually want to talk about a different subject matter. A member of our team found an obscure quote on the obscure parts of the web, talking about the way that I do demos and sort of some of the issues related to that. So I want to read you the quote, and then I want to make that the sort of substance that we take this discussion about today, because this is all about samples, samples, samples. It's a subject matter that's near and dear to me. I've been working with samples since I was 6 years old, and it's what's pretty much constantly on my mind. So I'm just selfishly going to talk about samples today. I hope that's okay. But let me read you the quote from the web here, and then let's do a little bit on that, and then let's get into the whole discussion about sampling music instruments, what constitutes sample libraries, quality sample gold, and when it happens and when it doesn't happen, and how to learn to use sample libraries, understand their little souls, and all that stuff. But let me read you the quote first, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty. As with all of 8dio products, I recommend taking the demos with a few grains of salt. Troels is a talented composer and expert at production using his own libraries. I'm cautiously optimistic, but also worry that this will turn out to be a typical 8dio release that makes me take out my wallet, but eventually put it back because of all the past products I have, they've cut corners on. I'm looking at you, Century Strings. Very, very interesting, because I actually see the camp of sampling sort of dividing in two ways. The first way is that, well, if you do a violin, it should be able to do anything you want. When we do a sample library or choir, it should be able to do anything you want. And we can actually do that. The problem is that it's not going to sound that good if we do it that way. So our sample philosophy at 8dio is more about really, really accurate acoustic representation of instruments. They will not be able to do everything, but they'll be able to do some things a hell of a lot better than your generic approach. So I would say we're in the sort of more specialized camp of sample development. Now, let me give you an example to put that in context. Let's take an instrument like the clarinet. In an orchestral setting, the clarinet has one type of aesthetic. For example, you don't use vibrato that often when you play the clarinet in the orchestra. Let's go to jazz music. There's generally a lot of vibrato in the clarinet, and the playing style and the phrasing is somewhat different than it is in the orchestra. Let's take the clarinet in an ethnic setting. It's very, very different. All of a sudden we're dabbling with more notes, we're dabbling into the territory of non-Western scales, and all of a sudden you have a very different instrument. And let me ask you this, is it possible to have one clarinet library that can play classical, jazz, and ethnic with the same patch? No, it's not. You can argue that through sample modeling, and you can use scaling and all this and that, like you could do it, but there's more to samples than just the sample and its physical structure itself. There's the player behind it, the soul that is playing the instrument. How many classical clarinet players can also play jazz and also play ethnic, you know? You're starting to see a more sort of shrunken version of the limitations of a given instrument. So in order to do the clarinet the right way, you would have to record it for orchestra, you have to record it for jazz, you have to record it for ethnic, and within ethnic there's many, many sub-styles. So where do we begin when we talk about samples? Like, do we go in the generic camp where it can do everything, or do we go in the specialized camp? We are in the specialized camp, and it's certainly the way we are going to keep on developing libraries, because at the end of the day, we're trying to create real instruments with emotion. So that's why we're so obsessed about going into the soul of a given specific type of music. Let's take choirs, for example. We have a children's choir, right? It's beautiful for those kind of things, whether it's like sweet children's stuff or whether it's horror stuff, that's perfect for that. You're not going to use it in a symphonic setting with your normal choir, right? So we have Lacrimosa, an epic choir, 200-person choir designed for epic music and specific type of phrasing and singing for that. We have Enceladus, which is designed for much more ethereal, soothing kind of sound. We have our new Silke library, which is a lot more with rhythmic choirs and experimental choirs. We have our old Requiem, which is sort of an all-in-between kind of library, and so forth. We have our Studio Soprano, which is a very small Debussy kind of thing for that style. Each of those choirs do different things, and they do them well, but they do not do everything. And I think that's where it breaks sometimes when we're having these discussions, because in order to understand samples and how they work, and the frustration about like, well, it doesn't sound like that demo, it's because you have to learn to work with the samples, understand their little souls, understand their restrictions as well. In the same sense that when you work with a player, he's also going to have his restrictions. You know, ask him to do jazz, classical, and ethnic in the same session. It's not going to work out that way. So that's what it's about for us. It's about finding the soul in the samples, you feeling that soul when you play it on the keys. It cannot do everything. It's not supposed to do everything. Maybe that's like the grand secret about it all. So I think it's important because many people tend to force the samples into a realm where they don't want to be. It's kind of like taking a children's choir and putting it into a classical setting. It doesn't work that way. You have to find the instruments for the type of music you want. And there's some tricks when you work with samples in terms of understanding their nature and all that stuff. And the first trick, and the simplest one, and the one that seems the hardest for people to understand, is simply to use your ear. Don't force your intellect over the samples. The second you start forcing them and say like, well, you know, Century needs to sound like John Williams, like, are you sure? Century is designed with one specific thing. If you want like really bright Williams legato, look at our anthology series, which was derived from Agitato. We got some very, very specific things in there. Sample libraries are specific. They're not always generic. We do have generic libraries, pianos, there are many aspects of strings as well. But generally speaking, once we venture into the realm of orchestral samples or brass woodwinds, choirs, strings, those four in particular, things get a little more advanced. There's a lot of individual expression in the instrument. Think about the violin. Designed to accompany a human singing back in the day, so you had a traveling partner. Probably the most expressive instrument together with a few others, right? The margin for error when you play those high pitches is so small, you almost get it wrong every time unless you're really good. So you develop your own method of vibrato, for example. You try different players, you're going to find very different sound, even up at those little margin notes in the high strings. So why is that? Well, personality in the samples, a person in there. So I almost want to talk like personality or sample persona, if you will, that there needs to be something in the samples that is communicating something, and it's up to me as a developer to communicate what that something is. For example, if I could look at our own libraries, I would say that Legato 1 in Anthology is better than Legato 2. Legato 2 was derived from our first sessions with Adagio. Legato 1 was derived from our Agitato sessions where we got a little more shine and vibrato into the legato. And so the latter goes. Nothing's perfect, but the samples have a personality to them. So when you see me demo and all that stuff, it's not actually because I sit and practice tremendously or anything. Like, I never practiced on a keyboard, never had a teacher, never anything. This is just having fun with the samples and trying to listen to them. The samples are communicating something. Each of them have a little bit in like of a person that they're trying to communicate to you. But if you force it into a like wrong setting, it's not going to work. It's going to be like some coke sniffing rock star trying to conduct a symphony. You know, it just doesn't work that way. So the thing I'm trying to do with our libraries is to make and more libraries that have a soul and a heart in them. And the thing I would love to offer to you is to help communicate what that soul is so you can make your own music with it, because obviously I'm completely locked to my own little world and style and all that stuff. So that's the beginning. And now it's time for a little sip of wine before we go into this long conversation, hopefully not too long, about samples. All right, let's talk a little bit about different playing styles and how that affects an instrument. For example, here in the Prophet X right now, I have an electric guitar loaded, and I'm just gonna play it like a keyboard to begin with. So that's sort of a piano keyboard-like way of doing it. Many people will play it like that way, but if you do a little more sort of strum emulation, you can start feeling like that strum action, and that's important. And each instrument, everything you're ever playing when it comes to acoustic instruments, each require different kind of feels when it comes to it. Or with a lead guitar, if I was to play that sort of more keyboard solos, it would be more like. But with a guitar, it'd be like, you know, all those little note bends and licks that you do. You can particularly hear it with distortion. You were like, instead of, you know, that kind of style. Or with something like a clavinet, if you were to play that in a normal piano fashion, it's like, where if you're really to play it in a more sort of clap way, it's more. that kind of stuff. So all those little licks and movements, they do make a difference in terms of representing what a clavinet actually sounds like. Or if we take like a more expressive tonal percussion instrument, you can play piano like. Where with this one, I feel more of a sort of Brazilian feeling, a little more like sway in the rhythm. A little more feel. That's what the instrument, even though this is a little more in the abstract realm, but that's how that instrument appeals to me. And it certainly doesn't sound good if you just play it with piano chords. Unless you're doing like basic EDM stuff, something insulting like that. Or if you were to take an instrument in the more sort of brassy realm, a saxophone for example, let's play Careless Whispers in a keyboard way. Whereas if you used to do it the sort of sleazy way, you add some reverb to it, and then you bend the notes down here in your pitch bender and mod wheel as well. There's a different feel to it. So this is a good example actually of an instrument that has a certain aesthetic in terms of how it's played, and if you just go on the keyboard, you're not going to get that response from it. Like this instrument likes bended notes. Just those little like, squeezing the note. Or if you had a large like taiko drum ensemble, you can play them more or less in a sort of a drum machine fashion. But in reality, they roll more when they play. They have a lot of like little cool percussive licks and more like those small things that do make a difference. It mimics the real ensembles a little more. And it's not always just about how we can learn from the acoustic realm and playing techniques and how they mimic on a keyboard. If we take an old school kind of funk solo kind of sound, there's only one way in my opinion that can be played. Alright, something like that, right? Or we take something like an upright bass of sorts, for example, like you could play it like. But if you want to go a little more jazzy and actual upright, there's a lot of those like. Those little tiny rhythmic licks that helps mimic the real instrument, and don't be shy on using your mod wheel and pitch bender either. Or if you take something like a synthesized flute, you can play more keyboard like. But you can also play more. I really look for where is the beauty in the sound. I don't think like, okay, this is a flute or it has to do this. Like, no, how does this sound most beautiful when you play it? So, for example, it's kind of nice putting a little bit of vibrato on the end note. And also bend it a little bit, and that sort of takes it out of a normal flute level, but more. Just you learn, you listen to the instrument like what sounds good, and then you go for that. And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about learning to listen to the samples instead of just saying, well, it should be doing Bach, whatever. No, listen what this little synthetic flute is best at, and then compose towards that. Take the best aesthetics of the instrument, incorporate it into a composition. Or for example, this patch here called Crystal Lake Piano, which is a mixture of a ukulele and a grand piano. And in this case here, you can play it like a piano. But that's not necessarily how it sounds best. You could also try to strum it since it's ukulele. But even that doesn't sound kind of good. So I'm like, okay, what is this sound trying to tell me? Like for example, I can hear there's a soft quality, so it sounds better than. It doesn't sound that good played hard. So for me, there's more of a sort of soft tension to it. That was even too much. It's almost more like a solo instrument for me. And you can see I'm using strumming techniques here instead of just. Okay, I just loaded another patch here called EDM-matic. I haven't tried it before, so I'll just completely just try from scratch. We'll see. That's kind of cool. Okay, that was funny just to explore and have fun sometimes. Or an abstract string instrument where the sounds sort of play in these different arcs. You can play piano like. Or in the case of a drum set, you can go more like drum machine, like. But in reality, it's a little more like that's one example. Or if you play like a basic MIDI groove. It's a little bit boring. Up here, you can actually sort of choose the degree you want to open the hi-hat. So instead of just like. You can do more gradual opening, so. Just a little more of that, sort of all these little. More of that feel you get with a normal drum set. But I thought it could be interesting to wrap up this video by taking an unpolitically correct sort of view on this forum post again. So if you don't mind, let me just read it again and reflect upon it in a very open way. I haven't prepared any statements. This is completely just my honest, raw feedback on it. As with all ADO products, I recommend taking the demos with a few grains of salt. And you totally should. I think that's very true, actually. Take them with more than salt, like take them with wine and pepper, whatever you want. The demos are a way of showcasing the library the way they were intended to be used. And like when we take the choir here, it's completely naked demos, like that's sort of it. And there's many small artifacts, like the S sounds, for example, because I'm time stretching too long, gives a little more of an S. A little sort of too much in the S quality to the feedback. Troels is a talented composer, thank you, and an expert at production using his own libraries. I don't know if I agree with expert in production actually. I think I always think I'm kind of weak in production actually. So that's always an area I focus more on. I'm cautiously optimistic but also worried that this will turn out to be a typical 8DO release that make me take out my wallet but eventually put it back because of all past products they've cut corners on. I'm looking at you, Century Strings. Imagine you spent 3 years of your life doing a string library. There's nothing else. Like there's barely any family or anything. This is like everything you do for 3 years. The production is almost $1 million. There's over 200 people involved in the production, and it takes 3 years. On top of that, you go like, so Dino has never really been done well, so we need to do everything again we've just done, but with mutes on this time. Add that to the mix as well. Add some harps to the mix, Century harps. Add some Century ostinatos to that. Add whatever it is that you want to add to that. We're looking at 3 years of only doing that, And it's something that's completely missing in forums because people just don't have the patience, understanding, whatever, to actually do it. Buy a pair of running shoes. See how good a runner you are. You gotta do the work. You have to learn to use the libraries. Orchestration is not something you just do, it's something you spend time on, something you love doing. And I think like this notion that when you take a library as big as Century, that's really, really been a substantial production, and hopefully display the quality and depth that we want in libraries, just to have a little bit of that in the back of your mind to think about like, okay, there were criticism we got on Century, like for example, people like wanted like orchestral seating, not just the ability to choose where they want to be in the hall, which we really thought were a cool feature, but people actually want like pre-designed orchestral seating. So we're doing that in one of the updates. And that's important, that's valid feedback. When somebody just slings out a comment, there's no substance to it, like why should we provide more substance in our answer? Well, to better the community, to better our understanding of samples. So now my phone is calling. Maybe that's because I'm actually supposed to not talk anymore. This is my wife calling, so let's try to record. I'll put her on speakerphone. Noonie Bear.
Bear.
How's it going, Noonie Bear?
I'm bummed that I'm not there.
You're bummed that you're not here. Right. Do you want to describe that bumpness a little bit?
I just wish I was there.
Right. That makes sense. I was actually in the middle of recording a blog right now, or the vlog. You know the subject we talked about this morning in terms of so I'm actually recording that. I'll send it to you. It might be like too personal or whatever, but I thought it could be interesting to just try it out.
Anyway, okay, well, I won't interrupt you.
No, that's okay. You're not interrupting.
Okay.
In fact, I'm actually in the middle of my vlog right now recording our very conversation. So you're being recorded right now, even though you didn't know it.
I see. I can probably tell because of your voice.
Yes, my voice was a little more formal and stiff.
Your voice is so much more peppier, and it's like, yeah, more formal for sure.
So what do I sound like normal when I'm not like recording? Like, what's my normal voice?
Well, it doesn't have like this to it. Like it has it's like you have a little more tightness and like a little more like up. I mean, your voice is very nice. Like, how can I explain it?
I think you're explaining it just fine. So I'll try like.
It's just more like you're optimistic and
Right.
Yeah, right. Whatever you say.
Right.
Well, yeah, man. Mm-hmm.
Right. So I'm not like that in my everyday life. I'm more like dystopian and dark. Like, what's the deal?
No, I didn't say that either. You're not dystopian and dark. You're just like, hey, you have a very nice voice. It's just a little more wound up for these kind of things.
I totally agree. I think as I get better at the vlogs, I think I'm gonna be less and less formal actually. Like this last part here was just to attempt to actually loosen up a little bit and give an unpolitically correct like way of looking at these.
Oh my God, you're totally doing it right now.
Yeah, no, I can hear I'm doing it. Yeah, okay, I'll try not to do it. Okay, you're absolutely right.
Jesus, try not to do it. Okay.
Well, it's because when I look at the camera, like
when you look at the camera.
right, it feels like there's like kind of like someone looking at you, and you have to like speak in a certain way. So maybe I should try not to look at the camera.
It gets you all excited. You start using your diction. You start using your ups and lows and your softs and your ups and downs.
I mean, it is more entertaining to listen to than somebody just going completely generic in like a stream of words.
Now you're doing good. There you go. I like it.
So I speak like this more. You like this more, like when I'm just more generic and flat.
Oh man, be chill.
Right. I'm not chill. I'm too hyper. That's what you're saying.
Be chill, dude.
Yeah.